Hi, good morning, everyone. I am Bernard Yang of ABFER and NUS Business School. Welcome to the inaugural session in our webinar series, Innovation, Productivity, and Challenges in the Digital Era, Asia and Beyond. Professor Susan ATHEY of Stanford will deliver a lecture titled Digitization and Artificial Intelligence, Challenges and Opportunities for Policy. And Dr. Pulak of Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, will chair the session. Artificial intelligence, big data, multi-level neural nets, cloud computing, the Internet of Things, and other digital technologies are transforming the world. They are strengthening innovations and productivity and reshaping individual business and government behavior. Asia has taken many leading endeavors that help the continent to make noteworthy leapfrogging development. Yet, there are many pending profound challenges, including in policy and regulations area. ABFER therefore team up with CUHK, Tsinghua SEM, and NUS Business School. You can actually see the collaborators at the bottom of the screen. We together organize this monthly webinar series to feature and promote important quality research on these topics, particularly those related to Asia Pacific. I want to thank Professor Susan ATHEY for delivering the inaugural lecture. We are grateful and we are very eager to have you share your knowledge and wisdom with us. And we are very grateful that you do this despite of your very busy schedule. And let me thank the organizing committee, including Yubo Chen of Tsinghua, Pulak of IIMB, Amici Egami of Yale, Michael Zung of CUHK, Daniel Zhu of Duke, and Yi Huang of Fudan University. And also to the audience for your support, and the ABFER administrative team for working hard on the logistics. Pulak, the floor is yours. Please take us forward.
Thanks, Bernie. Thanks, Susan, for doing this. This is really going to be exciting to learn on this really great topic, which is making all of us are going through. I would introduce Susan briefly, although all of you know about her. She is currently the Economics of Technology professor at Stanford Graduate School of Business. She received her bachelor's degree from Duke and PhD from Stanford. She also holds an honorary doctorate from Duke University. She previously taught at MIT, Stanford, and Harvard. And she is an elected member of the National Academy of Science and is the recipient of the famous John Bates Clark Medal. Her current research focuses on the economics of digitization, marketplace design, and the intersection of econometrics and machine learning. She has worked on several application areas, including timber auctions, internet search, online advertising, the news media, and the application of digital technology to social impact implications. As one of the first tech economists, she served as consulting chief economist for Microsoft Corporation for 6 years, and now serves on the boards of Expedia, Lending Club, Rover, Turo, and Ripple, as well as nonprofit innovations for poverty actions. She is also serves as a long-term advisor to the British Columbia Ministry of Forest, helping architect and implement their auction-based pricing system. She is the founding director of the Golub Capital Social Impact Lab at Stanford GSP and associate director of the Stanford Institute of Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Susan, thank you, and we look forward to your talk.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today, and it's great to see some new faces. This is a great opportunity while we're in this virtual world to get to meet people from all over the world that I wouldn't always see. So today in this inaugural lecture, I'm going to give a bit of an overview. I'm going to talk about some research by others, as well as some of my own research to try to give a big picture about these questions of the impact of AI and digitization on the economy. So let me start by sharing my screen. And if you're interested in more of the details of any of the papers, a few of them are not posted yet. I'll try to indicate, but I have a fair bit on my website, which you can check out, and I've got my website here. Actually, I should have put the website up as well. I also have a number of other web resources, including a set of tutorials around machine learning and causal inference, and videos from my courses that I've just got them onto YouTube. So if anybody's interested in any of those materials for teaching or your interest, please let me know. So let me start with some general themes about what I think is important when thinking about the impact of AI on the economy. The first is that we've had some really important advances in AI in recent years. And the biggest one by far is the general purpose prediction algorithms. And so actually, as when I first started, talking to economists, social scientists, business researchers around machine learning and AI, I always felt like I had to kind of walk this fine line between, wow, yes, this is really amazing, but on the other hand, it's kind of limited. And that's basically, as we know, prediction algorithms solve a fairly simple class of problems. I think what's been really interesting about their impact is that, well, to start with, their general purpose. So like neural nets, you could take the same algorithm and apply them in lots and lots of different settings without having to change very much. And so that's made them really widely impactful. But on the other hand, they're limited. Like there's very few questions in the world where really the answer is truly a prediction problem or a classification problem, where you just have some X's and you want to know what Y is. And I think one of the things that's been really exciting in the more recent part of the AI era, just the last couple of years, is how many applications we've figured out that we can decompose the problem and find pieces of it that are well addressed by pure prediction problems, by prediction algorithms, but we put them together to make something that's much more. And I feel like that's actually really where to me as a researcher, where the wow comes in, and where I also feel like we're at very early stages. I guess, if you're an empirical social scientist like me, I've been running regressions for many, many years. It's really exciting to run better regressions, but at some level, it doesn't really feel like a breakthrough. But when you look at some of the ways that they've been used, that's where I get more excited at the conceptual level. So things like generative adversarial networks, the things that create fake images, fake stories, fake videos, there you're putting together two predictive type algorithms. One is the generator and one is the discriminator. In some sense, you're outsourcing the human judgment of whether you're making high quality fake stuff. You're outsourcing that to a robot. And so when you put two robots together, one robot is like a monkey throwing things at the wall, monkey typing at the typewriter, just making lots of fake stuff. But another one is an automated critic of that. Well, now you can actually like type a billion stories. And if you have an automated critic, eventually you'll figure out how to type good ones. And so that's a more of a novel idea from the perspective of people, someone who's already familiar with using statistics for many years. And it also has maybe more profound implications. If for certain types of business models, like if you were in the business of selling pictures that had to be medium quality pictures, well, now, a robot can make fake pictures. If you want to make pictures for advertisements or for your website or whatever else, you don't have to pay models. You can just make fake pictures. And, it basically can, reduce the returns to artists or creatives when you can make fake things. And they also, of course, change the economics of certain systems, because now, we can generate, 100,000 fake news stories and, have robots try to post them all on Twitter. And it gets a little harder to push those back. So it actually changes the economics of certain kinds of business models and means they have to be designed a little differently when it just becomes cheap to create fake things. Also, iterative experimentation and bandits. So we've understood for a long time how to do randomized controlled trials, randomized controlled experiments. But if we can actually automate the process of learning what works and have a robot run the A/B tests, sequential A/B tests to understand what works, that actually could really improve and speed up the process of discovery. And of course, reinforcement learning, similar. So I guess, on the one hand, the skeptic's view is, well, all that's really happened is we've gotten really good at automating tasks, automating simple tasks. But on the other hand, the thing that can be profound is, some things can change fundamentally if you actually automate a piece of the system. Now, when we go to think about what's going to happen, what's going to be the impact of all of these technologies, a second set of themes is around the potential for beneficial impact. And I'll elaborate on some of these in the talk today and give some examples, but really broadly, we think AI can help us get efficiency for both providing as well as receiving services. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, but basically, like when you can get services digitally, it can be a lot cheaper for the consumer to receive them. Education and training can also be automated. Safety and monitoring. We can basically at scale make sure that service providers are doing their job, that bus drivers are awake. We can make sure that regular car drivers are paying attention, and so on. But then there's going to be some potential trade-offs, because we may or may not see increases in productivity, and there also may be effects on labor demand, and that's one of the big things people have been worried about. When we go to think about additional policy considerations, some of the general themes that come through a lot of work is that, first of all, AI and digitization, we have a lot of general purpose technologies. So the cloud, machine learning algorithms, these are all general purpose. The same innovations can be used in lots and lots of different applications. So it's a bit like electricity, that it can really fundamentally change an economy, but also innovations that are made, whether they're in universities or in firms, can diffuse through the economy pretty quickly. And so, you see a lot of rhetoric around sort of some kind of zero-sum game, which even when you use it to talk about international relations, it's often wrong. Or you talk about trade wars, that's also often wrong. But certainly when we think about AI innovation, there's not like a US version of AI. These innovations just diffuse very quickly globally, and so even if you don't like them, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. And so we're really going to need to face all of the consequences of this AI coming into place, whether we want to or not. It can be used for good and for bad. Related to that, of course, is a specific example, is that AI can make governments much more efficient and much more effective. If you like what your governments are doing, you might think that's good. And if you think you'd like your government to do what it's doing for less money and less workers, that may also be really good. But of course, it can also change the optimal form of government and so on. So we may end up seeing AI and automation supporting different types of governments. So in that setting, then we really need to think about guiding and regulating AI. We need to think about how are we going to make sure it's used to benefit humanity as much as possible, and what kind of limits and safety should we put on it. And there's really going to be very different incentives and abilities to really regulate from the firms versus governments and the rest of society. We've seen a lot of attention to social networks, and some level, like on social networks, like people post bad stuff because people like to read bad stuff. So there's sort of going to be some of that's going to be inherent in any social network. But as a society, as a global society, as national societies, we hadn't necessarily really come to grips with what we wanted out of our social networks, and what kind of content moderation do we like, and what's safe and what's dangerous. And it's, although we would hope that firms that had billions of dollars in the bank would invest in that kind of R&D, there's also maybe it's too much to expect that any firm is going to anticipate and think through all of the unintended consequences of its technology. And perhaps, universities and society needs to be at the table in any case to have like a credible and informed position on what they should do. And then we also shouldn't expect firms to necessarily have the right incentives, to be aligned with social welfare in terms of the types of AI that they develop. So, firms are going to want to reduce costs while society may have other objectives. So that really leads to kind of, thinking harder about what is the economics of beneficial artificial intelligence. And again, the first point is AI development is endogenous. It's responding to incentives. Of course, there's technological capabilities and limitations, but for example, firms may be more likely to invest in R&D that replaces humans versus augmenting humans. And they may be less likely to do R&D that anticipates and avoids unintended consequences. So we may need to understand that governments need to promote that kind of R&D in universities and scientists, because we're just not going to see enough of it coming directly from firms. Now, the benefit side of that is that AI actually is a general purpose technology. So if you do invest in researchers to, invest more in directions of AI that are beneficial to humanity, if you invest in research that helps develop best practices, that identifies bias or that identifies fragility or instability in algorithms, that technology can be shared very broadly, and it may be adopted in the private sector as well as the social sector. Again, we may be able to use AI in the social sector to provide services at much lower cost and to scale best practices much more broadly. And of course, the traditional private sector also can do a lot of things that benefit humanity in pursuit of profits. Again, making goods and services more available, helping people get lower cost goods, helping have a more direct connection between manufacturer and consumer so the margins are lower. All of those things can be beneficial for consumers. Using AI to help consumers find things and increase the returns to producing targeted products that serve a particular niche of consumers. But as I mentioned, there's a number of misalignment between private and social incentives, cost savings versus labor externalities. Another one is market power versus consumer benefits. So we're generally going to see venture capitalists and funders fund AI-related businesses where they see a lot of profits. So we're going to see a lot of investment in areas where people anticipate market power. But if there's a lot of market power, the consumers may not necessarily internalize all the benefits. So again, we want to also think about investing things where there isn't market power. Investing in educational technology, maybe there's not as much profit there, but it could be very beneficial for the world. And the good thing about AI and digitization is that they typically have these scale economies that can be bad from a market power perspective, but from a social perspective, if you invest in the fixed cost, then you can scale to the world. So if you're trying to serve the poor, digital services have this really nice property that you can, once you get something that works, you can get it out to a lot of people at low marginal cost. So let me dive in a little more into this discussion about replacing versus augmenting humans. Replacing is kind of obvious. So I have some pictures of, a order screen in fast food restaurants. And of course, COVID kind of accelerated that everywhere. Restaurants replacing humans with the ability to order on an app while you're from your car or, at the front of a store. And Amazon Go stores, which are popular in the US, where, you can walk in and just take stuff off the shelf and walk out. And those are really replacing humans. You can run the whole Amazon Go store with like just one security guard. Versus augmenting humans. And I have an example of pretrial risk assessment where, a judge might be making decisions about pretrial release means being released on bail before you go on trial to see if you actually are guilty of a crime. And judges might be making decisions about lots and lots of people really quickly, and they don't have time to read all the files. So we can use machine learning to help give risk scores on people so that judges can incorporate more information and make better decisions. That's a type of example of augmenting a human and making them more productive. Of course, when we get into those examples, we have to think very carefully about bias and so on, and that's been a subject of a lot of recent research. Other ways of augmenting include, automating components of tasks to make them easier, automated performance improvement, or helping with safety, compliance, or memory aids. So when we get into this big debate about whether AI is going to replace a lot of jobs, here I want to present a few facts from a paper by Hal Varian. He has these two great titles, actually. It's always great if you come up with one great title for a paper, but he has two great titles. One is Automation versus Procreation. The other is Bots versus Tots. So I like the bots versus tots. Bots is the robot, tots are the babies. And in the top right here, it just has a little figure of like, how do we think about the impact of automation on society? It might be in the worst case, it could reduce the demand for labor. So shifting that demand curve for labor down. But what Hal argues in this paper is that the demographic trends are such that even with the most optimistic scenarios about the ability of AI to automate jobs, that effect is going to be small relative to the fact that the world is not producing enough tots, enough babies, not enough procreation. And this is a big issue now in the very developed world, but more and more parts of the world will start shifting into this. And of course, we see with, Japan has had this problem coming for a long time. They see it. And China just recently, changed their one-child policy, which you might argue was really just from a purely economic perspective, was a not a very sensible policy for the reasons that are clear on this slide. On the left, we have a chart of the dependency ratio for the OECD at the top, and then a bunch of individual countries. And what that is the ratio of people over 65 for every 100 people of working age. And the green is in 2015 and the blue is in 2050. And so one of Hal's points, which I think is a really good one, is that, we may not know how many robots we're going to have in 20 years, but short of global pandemics, that used to be funny, short of global pandemics, we do know, how many 40-year-olds we're going to have in 20 years. And we know how many 50-year-olds we're going to have in 20 years. So, it's very predictable, and we have very accurate understanding of what our supply of labor is going to look like going out. And it looks like we're not going to have enough workers. So on the right, we have some US statistics, the projections for the US population versus the US labor force. And you can see again, we're going to have a big gap. So he argues that really what we should be worrying about is the coming demographic crisis and not enough robots versus too many. Now, if you look on the left, you see like Japan is very high in this dependency ratio. It's the top country. If we look on this chart on the bottom right, this is a chart from Asamoglu and Restrepo, that's showing countries that have been having a lot of, the x-axis is the increase in the ratio of older workers to middle workers. And on the y-axis is the growth in robots. And so what they're trying to illustrate here is that the countries that have aging populations, aging workforces, are the ones that are investing the most in robots. In the top, they also show in a different paper that, the more robots, the less jobs. Yes, that's true. But in some sense, instead of thinking about the robots causing the reduction in jobs, it actually can go the other way, that if you're seeing a tight labor market and high wages, that's exactly when you invest in the robots. And so that development really is endogenous. And so maybe we shouldn't worry as much about the overall supply and demand. Now, I'm going to come back to this in a bit. That's gonna mask some very specific pain if an industry automates, there might be workers that have a very difficult time transitioning. There may be countries that have a difficult time with transitions. If you've got an area of a country where, you used to have miners and then they started having call centers, they had a bunch of unemployed people. So you stick a customer service center there, and then nobody uses the customer service center anymore because everybody's using an app and getting automated chatbot support. Well, when you close that down, now you've got an area where that was the only thing there. That's why they put the call center there. And now you've kind of destroyed the local economy, and people might have a very hard time transitioning. So I think we need to worry much more about, based on all of this, on targeted interventions rather than like the global idea that there's not going to be enough jobs or everybody's going to have to go to the beach. So that's going to really motivate some of the work that I'm going to show in the next part of my talk. About, really what I think we should be thinking about is like targeted interventions and more efficient ways to help pockets of people rather than kind of economy-wide problems in the labor market. On the left, I have an illustration that's just intended to highlight how complicated it all is when you want to start really thinking about the impact of a major shift in technology. And again, I made this picture sort of before COVID. And now that COVID is here, I think it makes it really easy to wrap your head around, just how hard it is to predict the spillover effects and the interaction effects from technological change. So, COVID comes and like suddenly, cities empty out and people are telecommuting, and then, people in the US, especially, people are saying they're not going back to work and they refuse to move back. And so we're getting this whole like rearrangement of cities. Some of the, smaller tech hubs in the US are seeing a lot of growth. Companies are really rethinking where they want to have satellite offices and so on. So we're seeing this whole reconfiguration of where people work. Where they work is also then in turn affects, what do they want to buy, and what do labor markets look like? Global labor markets, local labor markets. And all of that in turn is also affects, industry structure. So we're I think in the midst of a shift where, especially around the labor markets and the housing and city structure, we could see some fairly substantial shifts, or maybe not. We don't really know exactly how big the magnitude of these changes will be. One other piece of this is just to keep in mind, though, the reason this matters so much when you think about worker well-being, there's sort of two ways you can make a worker happier. One is you can pay them more per hour, and another is you can reduce their commute and give them, better housing per dollar. And those things are, of course, linked. If you're working in a city, you move farther away, you either like commute a long time in order to afford the house you want, or you live closer in and pay a lot for housing. But either way, people's commutes are incredibly important in terms of their well-being. And if we can do things, especially if we can use AI and automation in some way to reduce people's commute, that can be much more effective, because the commute time is just burned, it's just wasted. That can be much more effective than other types of labor market interventions. On the other hand, things like minimum wage can be very ineffective in a world where you can just automate. I think it's not surprising that places with high wages were the first ones that got rid of the fast food workers and put up the machines on the wall for ordering your food. Well, historically, minimum wages, didn't decrease employment in fast food, but they can going forward. All right, so now let's talk about using ML and AI for good and meeting the consumer where they are. So one of the big areas for investment, I think, going forward is providing services in a way that benefits consumers more, or citizens and consumers. So the first point is access and the value of time. Historically, access to specialists was limited by location and local scale economies. So if you needed a special doctor, you needed a certain type of educational specialist. If your kid had a reading disability, or you needed a specialized repair, you just didn't have enough scale economies in smaller towns in order to support that kind of specialists. And as a result, people get less good service. Poorer people, if they have to go physically to get a service, they have to take time off work, they have to get a babysitter, they have to go stand in line. And that time cost on people is incredibly costly. if you have old people having to go sit in an emergency room, they might get sick while they're in the emergency room waiting to be seen. So you've got people going to doctors, going to hospitals and getting sick while they're there, plus wasting a lot of time. So what we've seen in the pandemic is this ability to provide services remotely. And we've seen it is possible. We just needed to kind of get people off their butts and make it possible, change the regulations, get the doctors to do it, get everybody to change their processes. And so then we need to think going forward how we can then expand that in order to save time for the consumer. And we need to really value the time that people spend trying to get to their services. And if we're trying to provide training and education, we want to take advantage of underutilized and convenient time. Like people can do retraining or education while they're commuting, while their children are asleep. And we've seen that, we can see very high implied transportation costs among women's labor market choices in particular, that women are unlikely to take jobs farther away, especially low-income women, and that presumably relates to childcare responsibilities. And so this issue really crosses political boundaries, both poor people in urban areas, rural people, for that matter, rich, busy people don't want to wait in line, right? Nobody wants to wait in line. So we should all figure out how to capture that consumer surplus by investing in providing services in a more efficient way. We also want things to be personalized. We want to be able to automate access. We want to be able to provide education and training at the right level and pedagogy. Of course, there's lots of open issues around education, like credentialing and how to do it exactly, but we in principle can get education anywhere in the world. And all of us, of course, have been able to enjoy that. I've got my videos of my PhD course online, and now I can reach anybody in the world with those. Another area is automated monitoring, which has more ambiguous consequences. So I'll show you a paper that I've worked on around this, but in general, we can use AI in order to monitor and make sure workers are safe themselves, like workers on an assembly line are being safe, but we can also make sure they're safely providing services to others. We can evaluate the quality of in-person service provision. We can make sure that a home health aide is actually giving their medicine and they're not engaging in elder abuse. And that makes it easier and cheaper to provide home health aides. We can make sure government workers are doing their job, making sure they show up to work, make sure the doctor is at the clinic. We can avoid corruption. So these are all additional advantages of automated digital service provision. If that's going to be if we're going to go and do all of that, though, we have to think about how we're guiding AI. We have all of these issues that many of us have been thinking about: fairness, bias, access, going towards societal benefit. One of the areas that I think is just really starting to make good progress in machine learning is robustness and stability of models, trying to understand how well they hold up in changing circumstances. Suppose you were doing credit scoring before the pandemic hit. Your deep learning model you might be a little scared about what that's going to do once everything about your data changes. And how can we understand models and make them more robust to changing circumstances? Market power, we see a lot of concentration and a lot of scale economies. What kind of regulations can we have that would help make sure that we get the competition we need to benefit consumers? Can we have a cost benefit approach to regulation? And of course, data privacy and security. So let me give an example here from a paper I worked on. This was around ride sharing. And in general, the problem that this was solving is that marketplaces like Uber, Lyft, whatever your local ride sharing company is, they need to provide incentives and screen for quality. But things like ratings are noisy, they're often missing or biased, and they're uncomfortable and time-consuming for consumers. So an alternative is direct monitoring and feedback to suppliers in a marketplace. So what you can do is you can gather data passively, then you can use a machine learning model to try to relate the customer satisfaction data that you do have to the passively collective data. So then you can give every single ride or every single interaction a score, a quality score, and you can use that to provide feedback and coaching to the seller, to require training. You can put explicit incentives on it, and you can kick people off if they're not meeting your standards. So one of the papers I wrote was using data from Uber, and we looked at how you could, first we did something comparing Ubers and taxis and showed that the Ubers were driving more safely than taxis based on telemetry data. And then we looked at a randomized experiment where we nudged drivers to have better driving performance by randomly selecting drivers to get feedback about the quality of their driving. And so what we found was a small effect on average, but a much larger effect for drivers whose performance was poor prior to the experiment. And so the way that we did this, on the left, I have just a little illustration of the machine learning model that we used to, what we did was we predicted star ratings on a sample where we did have star ratings based on accelerations, brakes, speed metrics, and how the cell phone was mounted. And we use that to predict how good the ride is going to be from a consumer satisfaction perspective. And then we use that as an outcome in an experiment. And we looked at the treatment effect of this information. And so what we found here, the interaction effects, if we looked at the treatment effects, we found kind of insignificant effects on people above the 10th percentile of driving before the experiment. But people who were in the bottom percentile of driving before the experiments were generally seeing a positive treatment effect on their predicted star ratings. So this is interesting as a, as a general application of machine learning and so on, but it's also interesting because it's an example of what you might call worker surveillance. So here we're using the phone to measure the quality of the worker. Now we're doing this for safety. It's happening for good. So, you may not be too worried about it here, but in general, this type of thing can be done in factories, and it is being done in factories. It can be done for, bank tellers. It can be done for teachers in a classroom. In principle, you could put a camera anywhere and create a training data set where humans judge part of the data set, whether you're doing a good job teaching, whether you're compliant with safety, and then you could get an automated score for that. And of course, that could be great if you're trying to make sure that workers aren't, you could identify safety issues so workers don't get hurt on an assembly line. But it also has a lot of, less good things could happen from that as well. And we have to think about what world we live in if we're all being kind of watched all the time. So that's going to be a really interesting policy issue going forward. Another issue that's been talked about a lot is that, for things like credit scoring or providing access, we can use machine learning to improve the quality of credit scoring and use people's digital footprint and things they do in the world to try to, predict whether you're a good credit risk. And I advise a company that does that, and it's a great idea. But those types of models can also be manipulated. So this was an example where it turned out that a certain insurance company, their machine learning model had figured out that people with Hotmail email addresses were riskier. So they were charging more for drivers with Hotmail email addresses. But of course, that's manipulable. Once people know about that, once this news story comes out, people create a Gmail address just to apply for insurance, and the power of the model goes away. So understanding the feedback effects from putting these things into practice is something that we need to do a lot more work on. People change their behavior once they understand the model that they're being subjected to. Another way that machine learning can be used for good is to identify the vulnerable and to target interventions. So I'll just give a few examples from some research papers. These two are in progress. One is based on, now here I'm going to Scandinavia because Scandinavia has really good administrative data about their populations, unlike the US. So this is a study where we're looking at a recent retirement reform that was put in Denmark. And we wanted to understand who was being affected by the reform in order to understand what the implications might be for, who are you getting to go to work by taking away retirement benefits? And so just looking at the data, each of these vertical lines correspond to different cohorts where they were eligible for early retirement benefits to start with at age 60. And then as over a period of time, they kept pushing back the age at which you could get early retirement benefits. And so what these charts are showing is for each of these cohorts, how much were they working? And so you can see on the right, people with a master's degree or equivalent were working past the early 60s. So they were making a lot of money in the labor market. They had good jobs. And so even when early retirement benefits were available to them, they kept working. Working wasn't bad. It paid well. They kept doing it. And so the retirement reform has modest effects for those people, but they're really very modest. While if you look on the left for people like that have only lower secondary education, we see huge effects. These people, they're always quitting as soon as they're eligible for early benefits. The idea is they're not making as much money. They don't like their jobs. They might have manual jobs. And so they're quitting as soon as they're eligible. So this retirement reform really is mostly affecting the lower education people. So what we did then is we used machine learning to predict based on people's characteristics before age 60, what they were going to do. So we built a model that was basically a classification model for which path a person would go on. And it's a little complicated because there's different types of paths you can be on. You could be on like disability benefits. There's different ways you can get there. What I want to focus on are the blue and the green here, the teal and the green. Those are the groups that we predict would have taken up the early retirement benefits if they were eligible. And we can see that what we're plotting here are the actual average outcomes for those groups. We predict based on their data before age 60, but then we look at what actually happened to those people. And we see that those people have a really big effect of the reform. So basically we've predicted here are two groups that should have been affected by the reform. And indeed, we're able to tell them apart well, which is just basically saying the machine learning is working. We really are able to distinguish which groups are affected by the reform. Then we go and try to understand, what are the characteristics of the people most affected? And in the top left, we look at income, and just averaging over everybody, there's a really strong relationship between income and the effect of the reform. And that means that basically the lowest income people are the people who used to take the benefits, and so if they have the benefits, they work a lot less. And now, and in this case, the y-axis is a number of weeks, 6 months after eligibility. So having access to benefits makes you much less likely to be working. So high income people are not affected, low income people are affected. But even in the left picture, we can see that our general machine learning model, which creates these red and blue lines, these green and blue lines, those people are especially affected by the reform. So income enough doesn't really explain what's going on. It's really a much more complicated machine learning model. But in principle, it's very predictable who's affected. And so if we wanted to target support or things that would help the set of people, we can identify them, and machine learning does a good job, and it does a better job than just simple covariates. A similar paper looking at administrative data from Sweden, where we're using administrative data. And here we look at a sample of workers were working at plants that were closed down. And we build a machine learning model to distinguish workers who we say are resilient workers or less resilient workers. So again, the model is trained in one data set, and what we're showing here is our kind of test set averages. And so on the x-axis, we see the years relative to displacement when their factory closes. And then the two curves, one curve, the high curve are the ones that our model classifies as resilient. The low curve is the ones that we classify as non-resilient. And again, we see this big separation, which says that using machine learning, we're able to very well separate which workers are going to kind of come back after a period of years, will be back where they started, versus the workers who basically never recover. When we go and then try to interpret this further, we look at the gap and try to see what kinds of characteristics account for the gap. And we find that that industry and location characteristics are very important in terms of determining this. And so, in principle, the machine learning model does well, but the things that are really driving it are industry and location. So we might be able to target certain industries and certain locations for interventions. I'm going to close up with one last study. This is a little more micro level. And my lab is running a lot of studies like this. And so hopefully we'll be having even more papers coming out. We have a few out now, and we're going to be, we have a lot of them in progress. In this case, what we did was we were running a text message experiment to try to get students to apply for financial aid. So we have a randomized experiment in 2 different years where we randomized who would get this intervention. And the intervention was basically nudges and information to help them apply for financial aid for college. And this is a population of people whose parents did not go to college. So the overall intervention was big. It increased people's percentage chance of filing for financial aid, say from 37% people filing to 43%. This is what the text messages look like. There's a bunch of reminders and kind of some website links. What we do is with machine learning, we are going to try to estimate who it is that is most affected by this intervention, and then we design a policy to target those people. Now, here, one of the things we do in this paper is we try to distinguish between prediction and causal inference. You could ask, who should be targeted? Should we use machine learning without the experiment, just historical data, to target people who were unlikely to file on time? That seems plausible. If they were unlikely to file on time, nudging them should help. We could also use machine learning to predict the people who are likely to file on time. And then with the idea that maybe nudging them over the edge would be most effective. Or we can use data from the randomized experiment and build a model targeting the treatment effects and try to use causal machine learning. Here we use my generalized random forest package, which is a software package that I've developed, to target those with the biggest treatment effects. And so what we find is actually that the people for whom it's most effective to target are people who are already likely to file financial aid. And basically the interpretation is that people who are already likely to do it, nudging them over the finish line is more beneficial. This was a setting where the overall filing rate was pretty low. And so even for the people who we predicted to be the most likely to file, there was still additional benefit left from nudging them over the finish line. And so that's what actually worked in this case. But of course, in another case, it could be completely different. And so we argue that using causal machine learning to target interventions is an effective way to go. So just to sum up, I hope I've given a little bit of a tour of different strands of research, ranging from thinking about the overall impact to actually digging in to trying to improve policy and design interventions that actually have an impact. As mentioned, our lab is working on a bunch of those. We're working with a company called Stones to Milestones, which is an Indian ed tech company. We've worked with a Chinese ed tech company, and we're really trying to see how we can make all of these things work better for social impact. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for an excellent talk. I think overall, the takeaway is where AI is going, what are the things we are doing right now, especially the social impact. And it was eye-opening to see the clarification on the AI and labor market marriage. And there's a lot of other information around, so it's good to see that. And also the examples which actually put that prediction in itself is not very useful unless you put the prediction in a nice policy and economic setup where we can answer some interesting question. So those are all great learning, at least for me and for the audience. So I'll open up for questions. If anybody has question, you can raise your hand and we'll come to you.
So
yeah,
Daniel,
Daniel,
go ahead.
Daniel, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Susan. This is really eye-opening, and it's there are a lot of interesting stuff in the talk. I just have two questions. It does look like your talk's been kind of like split based on two themes. The first sets of literature you seem to be citing are the ones done by Jermoglu and the co-authors, where I believe my personal kind of readings like this more falls in the category of like automation and the robots. And for that line of literature, I have a long-lasting question, which has always been like, we do know there are a lot of other earlier general purpose technologies, for instance, like internet or like ICT investment historically. And we also know that they have certain features that's going to complement or substitute labor and over the time. So the question is like, when we look at these type of AI, robots and all these type of things, from an economic modeling framework perspective, what is actually new for this new wave compared with like what we have already known historically from the early wave of like IT revolution, and kind of like how do we think about that in terms of the relationship of those things related to the labor market outcomes of individual workers. So that's for the first part, and the second part about the kind of machine learning part. I also have a question about how do we define AI in that kind of territory of the research? Because one observation is that often these type of technologies are very much like data intensive, and that obviously because of its data intensive and data is sometimes private, sometimes public. It's also generate a lot of interesting question about who actually owns the data and might actually have the advantage, and also actually will amplify the advantage over time. And there's also a limit in terms of like externality of these AI technology generates, and versus like what's the trade-off of that relative to kind of individual privacy. So just been wondering what's your take on that kind of general kind of sets of questions. Yeah.
Oh, just a few small questions. So I'll do my best. So on the like, what's new about AI? I think when I sit on lots of panels where people are discussing this, and my colleague Eric Bernolfsen and Hal Varian and different people, different panels, but we're always talking about what's new. And I think generally the consensus that I see is that some level, it's not that new. It's not that new theoretically, and we do have a lot of lessons from the past. One other thing that's not new is that it's hard to see the productivity show up in the numbers. And but then we talk about like, well, it took electricity like decades to diffuse, and like the car and the electricity and telephone, like ultimately they reconfigured societies. Of course, they had an impact, but it's sort of it doesn't just all pop in an instant, and you have this like churn of investment where you keep, you're getting more productive, but you're also replacing stuff, and that's expensive. And so it just kind of smears out the impact in the numbers. In terms of the, I also feel that. So one thing that I do think is potentially different though, is that some technologies just like you really have to like tear out your whole factory. So it just takes time to rip out like a country's worth of factories and replace them. But if suppose everybody has already moved, their IT systems to the cloud, and they already kind of have they're using, their customer databases or using software as a service. And then somebody comes along and says, hey, I can plug in this customer service call center technology, and it'll just sit here on the same cloud right next to your customer database, and I'll just connect them. And, in a week, you're going to be able to, use this automated thing instead of your call center. Well, that's going to be like faster, because you're shutting down the call center and you're sort of replacing it with a service. And so I do think in some of these areas, we may see more rapid diffusion because of the type of technological replacement there is. So it's going to take a lot of firms a long time to like get their whole IT to the cloud. But my experience from the companies I've worked with is if you do have everything in sort of modern software with, software as a service and APIs between them, if you have a well-architected system, then it's like pretty easy to adopt something new. And so at that point, things just might transition more quickly than they have in the past. And that's something that I think we should be attuned to. Just like, we saw in the end, like misinformation, like, of course, it's always been a thing, but it was just hard to do it at scale because like the television, in the US, like we had a couple television stations and you just, they were kind of decent gatekeepers at the time. And then now we see like, you can have a whole fake news industry come up very quickly and we're slow to react to it. Then I guess on the AI and data thing, actually, Pulak and I are working on a paper together about this, about trying to understand the value of data. I used to work at Microsoft. I worked in the search engine. I spent a lot of time measuring economies of scale and thinking about those. And I found them to be very important, hugely important for things like search engines. And I do think, that's going to be something we have to be very attuned to, market power but I think a lot of times that's data plus the platform business model. And it's like, okay, if you have a search engine and you control, the mobile operating system together, that's very powerful. But on the other hand, we have seen this democratization, which really exceeded my expectations. So I also worked on cloud computing. I helped Microsoft develop their cloud strategy in the late 2000s. And at that time, I would say that like what's happened is exceeded my wildest expectations in terms of consumer benefit and kind of entry and innovation. The fact that, Microsoft spent, hundreds of millions of dollars doing R&D to try to figure out how to make machine learning algorithms run at large scale. And then, that software just gets given away for free to try to get people onto Azure. The fact that you could start a ride sharing app and you can use Google Maps API and you can, use Stripe for payments, or, you can use all these different payment systems and you can just piece this together and pop up an app, in such a short period of time using cloud services and servers. So, at some level, we've kind of cut the middle to some extent, but we've also have actually improved entry in some segments of the economy. And so I think we've really just reconfigured industries in a way that in some places is more competitive. Just like also, platforms, marketplaces have allowed small sellers, like, you can run your own car business, you can run your own hotel business, you can enter without, you can run your own, massage business without having to advertise and run a company. And so we've seen all these marketplaces come in and make it easier for very small businesses to succeed. Sorry, so Michael?
Thanks. Michael? Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, sorry, I'm moderating myself.
That's okay,
Sorry,
no problem.
So I guess my question is very much related to the previous one, just from a slightly different perspective. So I want to know your thoughts about, say, the potential divergence or convergence of AI technology across country, if we have a measure about AI productivity. So to some extent, I can see there is a potential convergence of AI technology, exactly as what you just discussed. Say the fusion of some new technology. For instance, we're using Zoom everywhere now. But on the other hand, it's also related to what you just mentioned, say the economy of scale. For instance, the advance of some AI industries in China, I think, is pretty much depend on its size. So if that's true, if that force is dominating, then we probably will see we won't be able to see convergence of AI technology across countries. So I just want to hear your thoughts on this.
So I think there's a really interesting set of questions around what is the source of competitive advantage. So my opinion is that now it's less about the algorithms and it's more about the learning by doing and the use of the algorithms. And so if that's the case, and I think if you look back, like, it's not surprising that like the search engines, came out of the US because they had a big market. And like, it's, almost all of the large technology companies, serving the US and Europe, most of them are coming out of the US, they have a large market, and then they enter Europe and they kind of gobble up the smaller players. And generally the US version is better. And a lot of times that's because they've had the scale economy, they've been able to test their services, they've been able to do all the A/B testing and so on. So I do think that China's user base is, you know, it's just amazing. And, you know, I'm working with a Chinese ed tech company, and, you know, they have like so many users. So, you know, you can really test out, like you could, you know, you can test very quickly, you can improve them quickly. And that's just incredibly powerful. Now, you know, there's a lot of issues going on about like, well, okay, are we going to have one thing in the world? I think it's, if there's two things in the world, you know, it's better than one. And then parts of Asia, of course, get this, like the US people coming and the Chinese companies coming, and they kind of meet in the middle, and there's a little bit of competition. I think that's better than having a world monopoly. But we, in some of those things, you know, we may need antitrust to make sure that competition remains. And, you know, I think if some of this is like know-how, something that used to make me really scared about Europe was that, okay, well, the search engines were in the US, like Amazon was in the US. So there was all this machine learning know-how in the US, and people were just moving around between Silicon Valley companies. And like, how is Europe ever going to catch up? Like, they didn't have any of that. And so were they just going to be completely left behind? Now, and I think similarly, like China, you know, there's like a lot of know-how there, and how do you make these systems scale, and what's the best way to engineer them, and the best trade-off between, you know, how big the models are and how fast they are versus their you know, how expensive they are, what the delays are. All of that kind of learning by doing is going to be easier to do with the bigger countries. So I think that is a consideration. But again, the thing that's kind of moderated that is that, in fact, we actually have seen more of the world participate this than I expected to. And I think that's partly because people have been able to access the algorithms. They're not just locked up inside the search engine. You know, some of them are just locked up inside the search engine, but the fact that this competition for the cloud induced companies to release their machine learning algorithms and to open source a lot more stuff made the world become more democratic and therefore a little bit less concentration of power than I thought it was going to be. But I thought it was going to be really bad. So, you know, if it's better than that, maybe that's, I don't know how, that doesn't mean it's good in an absolute sense.
Yi-Hwan?
Excellent speech. And let me ask one very different question related to AI and finance, especially when talk about the personalization. Because a lot of people want to have a kind of financial inclusion, you know, for investment, etc., etc. Who's the winner, who's the loser is number one, and can elaborate a little bit more in terms of personalization, KYC type. Number two, or very important in terms of policy, because AI for us is like a black box. But what's input? Do we have a sufficient data? Do we have sufficient data in terms of cost time, business cycle to allow us to have to lead to a next crisis, or you know, etc. in terms of policy discussion of crisis and price movement? Thank you.
Yeah, I think in terms of like, you know, macro predictions, like there's only so much you can squeeze out of a data set. So, you know, of course, there's now casting, like there's using, you know, there's trying to get faster predictions, but which of course in the pandemic, that would have been really helpful. But I think, you know, I'm not super bullish on like having huge changes in like macro forecasting in general, other than the nowcasting, like those kind of speedy, more granular predictions that we can get. But in finance, I think there's lots of opportunities. And actually, since we have such an international audience, and many of you are probably very influential in your countries, I think there's like a competitive advantage from having better financial regulation. So, you know, countries like the US, we have like this huge mess of financial regulation. Companies can't figure out, they've got to meet like 10 different regulators, and the regulators don't even understand the technology. So they're really held back in innovation. If you have a country that can do a good job and also build a good infrastructure, you know, that has good identity infrastructure in the financial sector, better safety, you know, you can really, I think, use AI to promote financial inclusion. And I think people are kind of afraid of it, but honestly, like, you know, I would rather have an algorithm, and I'd rather regulate an algorithm than a human. Like, you know, humans are full of biases, they make mistakes, they make quick decisions, they don't use all the information. So if you have smart regulation, and well-informed regulators, who are efficient, which of course, that's a lot of ifs, You can really promote the financial inclusion, and also, all of this automation can lead to much lower costs. Historically, like the banking system had tons of people working and just copying stuff from one system to another. It was broken, it was slow, and that just raises costs for everybody and makes it hard to compete. And I've sat in conferences with central bankers who are like, oh, well, I guess we need a little market power for financial stability. And I'm like, who are you representing here? You're the regulators. You're supposed to be representing the consumers. Like, we want competition. We want entry. We want fees to go down. And in the end, what are these fees all about? We're just moving bits around. The marginal cost is low. We should be able to get this right. We should be able to provide financial services very cheaply. And, regulators that are getting in the way of that it's just counterproductive. It's putting a tax on your whole economy. So I agree that that you can have problems, and especially with market power. Like, if one firm has a lot of data, then they can cherry pick consumers and they can deter entry. But if you are able to figure out how to, make things competitive and regulate AI well, there's just so much upside potential.
Thanks. Binke?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Susan. So clearly, I really enjoyed your talk, and AI and machine learning seems like to have a big impact on businesses and societies. So then we are researchers, so quite often I have to think about is what's the implication for us as researchers. So could you talk about your perspective, given your experience in this area and working with companies and government policymakers? What are the potential big impacts on the research community in terms of research questions and also the methodologies in particular, given that machine learning is a very a different methodology from the typical econometrics we're familiar with?
Let me give the good and some highlights on the good and highlights on the bad. So highlights on the good, nobody ever liked picking a functional form. It just, you pick a functional form and you're worried somebody else is going to pick another functional form and turn over your results. So you have your RA run 100 regressions just to make sure you're robust. And then you end up cherry picking results. But nobody likes that. The research assistant doesn't like it. You don't like it. And so machine learning allows you to outsource parts of your modeling and have a data-driven, reproducible, scientifically grounded way to choose functional forms. So I think that's just liberating. And then, I'm working with some of these administrative data sets, even shopping data sets. Well, historically, industrial organization economists and marketing people, you would study one thing at the time. You'd write your whole PhD thesis about yogurt or paper towels, even though you were sitting on a data set that had 1,000 other products in it. And, that was basically because it was too hard. We didn't know how to study them all at the same time. So machine learning automates that. Using this data from Denmark and Sweden, we had econometricians and labor economists working on that for years. But usually you have this data set with, the entire population and, hundreds of variables. And the first thing you do is you narrow it down to 5 variables and you run a simple regression, which is great, but you're throwing away, so much information. So the machine learning helps us wrap our head around, how can we use all of this? How can you use people's labor market histories when you can't possibly write down a functional form? But it still requires thinking, because, if you just run a big prediction, what do you do with that? It's just running a regression with 1,000 covariates in it. What would you do with the output? You wouldn't do anything. You wouldn't have any, you have to do another step afterwards, right? So you still have to think about what your question is and how you're using the data. But I actually find that it's crystallizing, because you really have to take a stand. This is the question. I want to estimate this parameter, and everything else is just, soaking up noise or adjusting for confounding or whatever else it's doing, right? So it really forces you to take a stand in a way running regressions doesn't. So to me, on that side, this is all beneficial. Another big part of research is that you have to, we can get involved in the process. If a system is changing all the time, if you're improving your educational technology all the time, the economist like me, I can get in there and say, all right, let's change it this way. Let's change it that way. Let's measure what happens while we change it. So it gives you a lot of opportunity to intervene and also to measure in a really new way. Some of the downsides just on research community. people are getting kind of annoyed at people like me, because they're like, wow, Susan, you can do all of this. Like, these people call you up, they give you data, you have all these research assistants, you have postdocs, like, you have this big enterprise. So we get this research inequality where, I'm able to do stuff that other people can't do. And that's not fair. So we have to figure out how to solve those problems. Of course, some of that is some data sets are public, and we need to make it easier for people to access data sets that are useful. But on the other hand, like even my PhD students, they get data. Like anybody's getting a PhD now. They have a friend who's joining some tech company, starting a startup. So actually my students, you think my students would be coming to me to make connections, but they have more connections than I do especially with startups. So I think it's not as bad as it seems, but I think it is true that some of this research requires more people, more teams. And economics and social sciences may have to they're moving a little more to a lab model where you have bigger groups of co-authors and longer term projects. So I think those are some of the issues, but we can figure these things out, right? Like your universities can band together and and get a big data set and let lots of people work on them. It doesn't have to all be at the individual level.
Thanks, Susan. I think it's getting pretty late on your side, so I'll just have 2 questions from the attendees. I'll read those out. One is by Tom Lamb. Hi, Susan, I have a question. Does the accelerated and widespread adoption of AI, perhaps as a result of the pandemic, raise the risk of putting the AI cart before the horse? So any comment on this?
I take the spirit of that comment that, we had things that we thought might change, and they're like, well, they're going to change slowly. And then the pandemic came around and we saw, this really rapid transformation. And so now I think we have to rethink what's going to go slow and what's going to go fast. So yeah, things may go wrong, right. Just like, and so I agree with that.
So we'll take one more question. I found it interesting. This is by Michael Fraze. I found it interesting that you were taking extreme groups and compared them in terms of effectiveness of an intervention. Are there not problems of reducing variance and getting artificial effects due to reduced variance?
So we try to be very careful about you do have to, I do agree there's a general issue of like, if you use a model and then the model says, hey, these are the really high people, and then you use your own model estimates to verify that, any time you estimate treatment effect heterogeneity, there's going to be a distribution due to sampling variation, and that can be spurious. So a lot of what we do in my papers is we use machine learning to put people into groups, but then we take the average of that group in a different data set. And then that's kind of a model-free evaluation of how well your model worked. And I should say that when I first started doing this, like I have some of my most cited papers are papers that really pushed estimation of heterogeneous treatment effects using these forests and then putting confidence intervals around them. And that was helpful, but actually in a lot of data sets, you don't have quite enough data to build these non-parametric models. And so you have bias, basically, like you're not able, your models are your estimates are not centered on the truth for any one individual. So we've moved towards, especially in data sets where there's less signal, to doing this, putting people into groups and then using separate data to look at the averages, because then you don't have to worry about whether you had enough data to estimate a 100-dimensional function or not. And you get model-free estimates of heterogeneity. So that's kind of, but I should say that there's still, my practice has been changing over the last years as I do applications. And I think figuring out like, what do you do with treatment effect heterogeneity is still something that's being like innovated on from application to application.
Yeah, I had a question, but in the interest of time, it's pretty late on your side. I'll stop the question Q&A here. Bernie, over to you for vote of thanks.
Well, thank you. It's really getting late. Susan, thank you for a very comprehensive, well-organized, and very educational lecture. Pulak, thanks for moderating the session so well, and the participants, thanks a lot for your very stimulating questions. I'm sure that we have a lot more questions in our mind, and that's what the lecture is for, is stimulate us to discuss among ourselves and do more research. For that matter, let me also draw your attention to November 3rd, our next lecture. Our next session will be on data-intensive innovation and, and the state evidence from AI firms in China by David Young from Harvard. So I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks a lot for everybody for your wonderful support. Thank you, Susan, particularly. Wonderful lecture. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Susan.